Bullies grabbed the quiet girl thinking she was an easy target. They had no idea her military father was watching from the shadows. What happened next would make them beg for mercy and change everything at Westfield Academy forever. Sarah Chen had perfected the art of invisibility by her sophomore year at Westfield Academy. At 15, she possessed the kind of delicate features that made adults coo about her being such a sweet little thing, while simultaneously making her a target for every predator in the teenage ecosystem. Standing barely 5 feet tall with shoulder-length black hair that perpetually fell across her face like a curtain, Sarah had learned to navigate the hallways of her private school with the careful precision of someone walking through a minefield. Her father, Colonel James Chen, had been deployed overseas for most of Sarah's freshman year, leaving her to adapt to their new life in Millbrook, Connecticut, without his steady presence. The military had moved their family 6 times in Sarah's short life. But this assignment was supposed to be different. Westfield Academy was meant to provide stability, a place where Sarah could finally put down roots and maybe, just maybe, make some lasting friendships. Instead, she'd discovered that private school cruelty came wrapped in prettier packaging than its public school equivalent. The uniforms were pristine, the facilities immaculate, and the students spoke in cultivated tones that masked venom more effectively than any street corner insult ever could. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of social warfare that played out in hushed conversations and strategically placed glances. The irony wasn't lost on her that Colonel Chen had specifically chosen Westfield Academy for its sterling reputation and anti-bullying policies. The glossy brochures had promised a nurturing environment where every student could thrive, where diversity was celebrated, and where academic excellence went hand in hand with character development. What they hadn't mentioned was that the bullying here was simply more sophisticated, harder to detect, and infinitely more psychologically damaging than anything Sarah had experienced at her previous schools. Sarah's strategy for survival was elegantly simple: become unremarkable. She'd perfected the art of bland responses, neutral expressions, and the ability to blend into any crowd without leaving a memorable impression. Her clothes were always neat but never stylish. Her grades consistently good, but never exceptional enough to draw attention. And her participation in class discussions carefully calibrated to avoid both teacher frustration and peer ridicule. Technique had served her well through countless military moves. New schools meant new social hierarchies to navigate, new bullies to avoid, and new ways to remain invisible until the inevitable next relocation. But Westfield Academy was supposed to be different. This was meant to be home, the place where Colonel Chen would finally settle into a permanent assignment at the nearby military installation. Sarah's desk in advanced biology was positioned perfectly for her purposes. 3rd row, 2nd seat. Close enough to the front to show engagement, but far enough back to avoid unwanted attention. She could observe the entire classroom dynamics from this vantage point, tracking the subtle power shifts and alliance formations that determined who was safe and who was fair game. The ecosystem at Westfield Academy was more complex than anything Sarah had encountered in her previous schools. The traditional jock-nerd popular kid divisions were complicated by factors like family wealth, social connections, and the kind of cultural capital that came from generations of private school attendance. Students here spoke casually about family vacation, homes in Martha's Vineyard, and summer internships at their parents' law firms, creating an atmosphere where Sarah's military background felt simultaneously exotic and somehow lesser. Her father's frequent deployments had taught Sarah to become self-sufficient in ways that her classmates couldn't comprehend. While they worried about which designer handbag to carry or whether their parents would buy them the latest iPhone, Sarah had learned to manage household budgets, coordinate her own transportation, and handle medical appointments independently. The skills that made her competent in real-world situations somehow translated to social awkwardness in the rarefied atmosphere of Westfield Academy. The Chen family's modest base housing stood in stark contrast to the sprawling estates where most of her classmates lived. Sarah had learned to deflect questions about her address by mentioning that they lived near the military base, a response that usually killed further inquiry. Her classmates seemed to view military families as a curiosity, something slightly foreign, and potentially dangerous that they preferred to admire from a safe distance. Colonel Chen's military bearing had shaped Sarah's upbringing in ways that made her fundamentally different from her peers. Punctuality wasn't just preferred in their household, it was mandatory. Respect for authority wasn't negotiable. Personal responsibility was assumed rather than taught. These values had created a young woman who was mature beyond her years, but struggled to connect with teenagers, who saw rules as suggestions and consequences as things their parents could make disappear with the right phone call. Sarah's lunch routine exemplified her survival strategy. She always arrived at the cafeteria exactly 12 minutes after the lunch period began, when the initial rush had died down but before the social dynamics had fully crystallized. She'd purchase her meal efficiently, locate a table near the windows where she could observe without being observed, and consume her food while appearing to be engrossed in whatever textbook she'd strategically brought as a prop. The routine worked beautifully for avoiding unwanted attention, but it also ensured that Sarah remained completely isolated. She'd perfected the art of looking busy while actually watching her classmates navigate the complex social negotiations that determine status, popularity, and survival. She could identify the power brokers, the wannabes, the outcasts, and the neutrals with the analytical precision her father had taught her to apply to any new environment. What Sarah hadn't anticipated was how her very success at remaining invisible would eventually make her a target. In the brutal mathematics of high school social dynamics, there was something almost insulting about someone who refused to participate in the game. Her classmates had initially ignored her, then became curious about her, and finally decided that her continued neutrality was somehow a judgment on their behavior. The whispered conversations had started gradually. Questions about why Sarah never seemed to have friends, why she never participated in social media, why she always seemed to be watching rather than participating. Her careful strategy of invisibility had paradoxically made her more visible, marking her as someone who thought she was too good for the rest of them. Sarah's bedroom had become her sanctuary, a carefully organized space that reflected both her military upbringing and her desperate need for some corner of the world where she had complete control. Her desk was positioned to face the window, where she could see the manicured grounds of Westfield Academy in the distance. The view served as a daily reminder of the battlefield she'd have to navigate, but also of the temporary nature of her situation. Colonel Chen's deployment was scheduled to end in 6 weeks, and Sarah had been counting down the days with the dedication of a prisoner, marking time until parole. His return would restore the natural order of their household, provide her with the protection that came from having a father who commanded respect, and maybe give her the courage to stand up for herself in ways that currently seemed impossible. The letters from her father had become increasingly concerned as Sarah's carefully edited descriptions of school life failed to mask her growing isolation. Colonel Chen possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of human nature that came from leading soldiers in combat situations, and he'd begun to sense that his daughter was fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. His most recent letter had included questions that were too specific to be casual, inquiries about her friendships, her teachers, and her overall happiness that suggested he was picking up on distress signals Sarah hadn't realized she was sending. What Sarah didn't know was that Colonel Chen had been conducting his own reconnaissance from thousands of miles away. Military fathers possessed resources and connections that civilian parents couldn't imagine, and his growing concern about his daughter's welfare had triggered the same protective instincts that had kept his soldiers alive in hostile territory. The quiet girl who'd learned to make herself invisible had no idea that her father's network of military contacts included personnel stationed at the very base where Westfield Academy's influential families sent their children. The stage was set for a collision between two worlds, the rarefied atmosphere of private school privilege and the uncompromising realities of military justice. Sarah continued her daily routine of careful invisibility, unaware that her tormentors were about to discover that some prey came with consequences they'd never imagined. Sarah's mornings at Westfield Academy had evolved into a carefully choreographed routine, designed to minimize human interaction while maximizing her chances of navigating the day without incident. She calculated that arriving exactly 17 minutes before first period provided the optimal balance, early enough to avoid the crowded hallways but late enough that most teachers hadn't yet arrived to notice her solitary presence. The colonial style brick buildings of Westfield Academy sprawled across 47 acres of manicured lawns and ancient oak trees, creating an atmosphere of academic prestige that parents paid $40,000 annually to access. Sarah had memorized every shortcut, every alcove, every maintenance corridor that allowed her to move between classes, without joining the flowing rivers of students who clustered in their familiar social groupings. Her first class, Advanced Placement, Literature with Mrs. Pemberton, represented the kind of intellectual sanctuary that had sustained Sarah through every school transition. Literature was safe territory, subjective enough that there were no definitively wrong answers, complex enough that class discussions required genuine thought rather than social posturing, and sophisticated enough that the typical high school power dynamics became temporarily irrelevant. Sarah had claimed the same desk since the first day of sophomore year, second row, far left, position so she could observe the classroom dynamics while maintaining the appearance of focused engagement. The seat provided clear sight lines to both the teacher and her classmates, allowing her to monitor the subtle social negotiations that determined who spoke, who remained silent, and who wielded influence through strategic interventions. Mrs. Pemberton had quickly identified Sarah as one of her most capable students, though their interactions remained carefully professional. The elderly teacher possessed decades of experience reading teenage behavior, and she'd recognize Sarah's isolation without understanding its underlying causes. Her attempts to draw Sarah into class discussions were always gentle, never forcing participation but creating opportunities for engagement that Sarah could accept or decline without embarrassment. The other students in advanced literature represented a cross-section of Westfield Academy's social hierarchy. Madison Walsh occupied the center seat in the front row, her perfect posture and designer accessories broadcasting her status as student council president and daughter of the Walsh family, whose name graced the Academy's newest science building. Her contributions to class discussions were always articulate, well-researched, and delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to be heard. Behind Madison sat Trevor Blackwood, whose family's pharmaceutical fortune had endowed the Academy's library and whose casual arrogance masked a genuine intelligence that Sarah grudgingly respected. Trevor's insights into the literature they studied were often brilliant, though he delivered them with the kind of dismissive superiority that made Sarah understand why her father had such strong opinions about entitled civilians. The dynamic between Madison and Trevor dominated most class discussions, their intellectual sparring creating a performance that other students watched rather than participated in. Sarah had learned to time her own contributions to the brief lulls in their verbal dueling, offering observations that were substantial enough to satisfy Mrs. Pemberton's expectations, while remaining neutral enough to avoid challenging either of the classroom's established power brokers. Chemistry, with Dr. Rodriguez, presented different challenges entirely. The laboratory setting required partner work that Sarah had never quite mastered, leaving her perpetually scrambling to find someone willing to tolerate her methodical approach to experiments. Dr. Rodriguez assigned partnerships randomly, a policy that theoretically promoted equality but practically guaranteed that Sarah would spend the semester working with classmates who viewed her as a liability rather than an asset. Her current chemistry partner was Emma Fitzgerald, a girl whose family owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Millbrook and whose bored indifference to academic achievement was matched only by her casual cruelty toward anyone she perceived as socially inferior. Emma had perfected the art of making Sarah feel unwelcome through 1,000 tiny cuts, arriving late to leave Sarah scrambling to set up equipment alone, forgetting to include Sarah's name on lab reports, and treating her contributions to their shared work as minor inconveniences rather than genuine collaboration. The partnership had taught Sarah valuable lessons about the subtle ways that privilege expressed itself in academic settings. Emma's casual assumption that Sarah would handle the detailed work while she focused on more important social interactions revealed a worldview where some people existed primarily to serve others' convenience. Sarah's military upbringing had instilled values of mutual responsibility and shared sacrifice that made Emma's attitude particularly galling. Lunch period remained the most treacherous part of Sarah's daily routine. The Westfield Academy dining hall was a cathedral of social stratification, with seating arrangements that reflected family wealth, social connections, and carefully maintained hierarchies that had been established over generations of private school attendance. Sarah had identified a small table near the floor-to-ceiling, windows that provided both natural light for reading and a clear view of the entire room's social dynamics. Her lunch selections were as carefully calculated as everything else in her survival strategy. Simple foods that could be eaten quietly, nothing that required special preparation or might create unwanted attention. She'd learned to time her meal purchases to avoid the lines where casual conversations might force her into social interactions she wasn't prepared to navigate. The conversations that swirled around her during lunch provided Sarah with a comprehensive education in the concerns and priorities of her privileged classmates. She'd learned to distinguish between genuine problems and the manufactured drama that seemed to consume so much of their emotional energy. Listening to Madison Walsh complain about her parents' refusal to buy her a new BMW when her current car was barely 2 years old had taught Sarah more about class privilege than any sociology textbook ever could. Sarah's afternoon classes, calculus with Mr. Patterson and European history with Miss Chen, represented the academic high point of her day. Mathematics provided the kind of objective certainty that social interactions lacked, while history offered perspectives on human behavior that helped Sarah understand her own situation in broader contexts. Both teachers had recognized her capabilities without attempting to force her into unwanted social situations. The transition periods between classes remained the most dangerous parts of Sarah's day. Westfield Academy's hallways during class changes resembled a complex dance where every student knew their role and moved according to unspoken rules that Sarah had never quite mastered. She'd learned to time her movements to avoid the clusters of popular students who commanded the center of the hallways, while also avoiding the alcoves where the genuinely troubled students gathered. Her locker, number 247, was positioned in a relatively quiet section of the sophomore hallway, far enough from the main traffic patterns to provide some privacy, while remaining accessible during the brief intervals between classes. Sarah had organized her locker with military precision, ensuring that she could retrieve necessary materials quickly without lingering in spaces where unwanted interactions might occur. The afternoon routine that had sustained Sarah through her first year and a half at Westfield Academy was beginning to show signs of strain. Her careful strategy of invisibility had worked well enough when she was genuinely new, when her status as an outsider could be attributed to recent arrival rather than social inadequacy. But as her second year progressed, her continued isolation had begun to attract the kind of attention she'd worked so hard to avoid. Sarah's teachers had started to notice patterns in her behavior that suggested problems beyond simple shyness. Her consistent academic performance masked a growing emotional exhaustion that was becoming harder to disguise. The energy required to maintain her careful facade of normalcy was beginning to exceed her capacity to sustain it, creating cracks in the protective shell she'd built around herself. Her father's letters had become increasingly frequent and increasingly concerned. Colonel Chen's questions about her daily life had grown more specific, his inquiries about her friendships more pointed. Sarah's carefully edited responses were failing to satisfy a man whose military training had taught him to read between the lines of official reports, and whose paternal instincts were beginning to override his respect for his daughter's privacy. The evening routine that concluded each day provided Sarah with temporary relief from the constant vigilance required to navigate Westfield Academy's social landscape. Her homework was completed with the same methodical precision that characterized everything else in her life, each assignment approaching with the kind of focused attention that her father had taught her to apply to any mission-critical task. Her bedroom had become more than just a sanctuary. It was a command center where Sarah could process the day's intelligence, plan tomorrow's strategy, and maintain the kind of situational awareness that had become second nature. The view from her window provided a daily reminder of the battlefield she'd have to face again tomorrow, but also of the temporary nature of her situation. What Sarah couldn't see from her bedroom window was the other intelligence-gathering operation that had been quietly established in her neighborhood. Her father's network of military contacts had begun their own reconnaissance, and the quiet girl who'd learned to make herself invisible was about to discover that some battles required different kinds of warfare than she'd been taught to fight. The ecosystem of power at Westfield Academy was ruled by a triumvirate of students whose families had shaped the school's culture for generations. At the apex of this hierarchy stood Bryce Kensington, a 17-year-old whose last name adorned the Academy's Performing Arts Center and whose great-grandfather had been among the school's founding trustees. Bryce possessed the kind of effortless charisma that came from never having questioned his place in the world, combined with an athletic build that had made him captain of both the lacrosse and tennis teams. Standing 6 feet tall with the kind of golden hair and blue eyes that seemed designed for yearbook photos, Bryce commanded attention through presence rather than effort. His blazer was always perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with precision that spoke to generations of men who understood that appearance was the first weapon in any social battle. When Bryce walked down the hallways of Westfield Academy, conversations paused, heads turned, and the entire social atmosphere seemed to reorganize itself around his trajectory. The power that Bryce wielded wasn't merely social, it was institutional. His family's donations had funded the Academy's newest dormitory, the state-of-the-art fitness center, and the scholarship program that allowed a carefully selected number of less privileged students to attend alongside the children of Connecticut's elite. This financial leverage gave Bryce's opinions weight that extended far beyond typical teenage influence, creating an environment where his preferences became school policy and his dislikes became institutional problems. Bryce's closest ally was Victoria Ashworth, whose family's media empire had made her last name synonymous with influential journalism throughout New England. At 16, Victoria had already inherited her family's talent for information gathering and strategic communication, skills that made her the most dangerous student at Westfield Academy. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family's secrets, every teacher's vulnerabilities, and every student's pressure points that could be exploited when necessary. Victoria's appearance was as carefully curated as her family's newspaper editorials. Her auburn hair was always styled in ways that looked effortless, but required considerable time and expense to maintain. Her uniform modifications pushed the boundaries of school dress codes while technically remaining compliant, creating a look that was simultaneously rebellious and refined. She moved through the Academy's hallways with the confident stride of someone who knew that information was power, and that she possessed more information than anyone else in the building. The third member of their alliance was Harrison Colby, whose family's investment banking fortune had funded the Academy's technology upgrades and whose analytical mind made him the strategist of their group. Harrison stood slightly shorter than Bryce, but compensated with an intensity that made him equally intimidating. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his uniform impeccable, and his presence marked by the kind of focused attention that made other students feel like they were being evaluated for weaknesses. Harrison's contributions to their group dynamic were less obvious but more essential than those of his more charismatic partners. While Bryce provided the public face of their power and Victoria gathered the intelligence that sustained it, Harrison designed the campaigns that eliminated their enemies and expanded their influence. His understanding of human psychology was sophisticated enough to design social warfare that left no fingerprints while achieving maximum damage to their targets. The three had been inseparable since elementary school. Their friendship cemented by shared experiences at exclusive summer camps, family vacations to European capitals, and the kind of cultural education that came from parents who viewed their children's social development as seriously as their academic achievement. They spoke in the coded language of inherited privilege, referencing shared experiences and family connections that created an impenetrable barrier between themselves and anyone who hadn't been born into their world. Their treatment of other students was calculated rather than impulsive, designed to maintain the social order that kept them at the top of Westfield Academy's hierarchy. They didn't engage in the crude bullying that characterized less sophisticated environments. Instead, they wielded exclusion, rumor, and social isolation with the precision of surgeons removing tumors. Their victims were selected carefully, targeted for reasons that made sense within their particular worldview, and destroyed systematically through methods that left no evidence of direct involvement. Sarah Chun had initially escaped their attention through her strategy of careful invisibility, but her continued neutrality had begun to register as a form of defiance that required correction. In the mathematics of high school social dynamics, someone who refused to acknowledge the established hierarchy was making a statement that threatened the entire system. Sarah's apparent indifference to their power had become an insult that demanded response. The decision to target Sarah had been made during one of their regular strategy sessions, held in the private study room that the Kensington family's donations had secured for student government use. The room was equipped with leather chairs, mahogany tables, and oil paintings that created an atmosphere of inherited authority that reinforced their sense of natural superiority. It was here that they planned the social campaigns that shaped life at Westfield Academy. The Chun girl, Victoria had announced during a particularly productive session, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made her observations sound like established facts. She's been here almost 2 years and still acts like she's too good for everyone else. It's becoming a problem. Bryce had nodded thoughtfully, his expression showing the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for lacrosse strategy sessions. Military family, right? Father's deployed overseas. That explains the attitude. She thinks she's better than us because Daddy wears a uniform. Harrison's contribution had been characteristically analytical. She's vulnerable. No real friends. No family support system. No connections that could create complications. Perfect target for a demonstration of how things work around here. The conversation had continued for nearly an hour, with each member of the group contributing observations about Sarah's routines, vulnerabilities, and potential pressure points. Victoria had gathered intelligence about Sarah's academic performance, her family's financial situation, and her social isolation. Bryce had identified opportunities for public humiliation that would maximize the educational value of their intervention. Harrison had designed a campaign that would escalate gradually, allowing Sarah multiple opportunities to submit to their authority before more serious consequences became necessary. Their approach to Sarah represented the culmination of years of practice in social warfare. They understood that effective bullying required patience, strategy, and the ability to maintain plausible deniability while achieving their objectives. The crude physical intimidation that characterized bullying in less sophisticated environments was beneath their methods. They preferred psychological warfare that left their targets questioning their own perceptions while creating no evidence that could be used against them. The initial phase of their campaign had been almost gentle by their standards. Bryce had begun acknowledging Sarah's presence in ways that made her uncomfortable without being obviously hostile. His greetings in the hallways were accompanied by smiles that never reached his eyes, creating an atmosphere of false friendliness. That left Sarah uncertain about his intentions. The attention was unwelcome, but not clearly threatening, making it impossible for Sarah to complain without seeming paranoid. Victoria's contributions had been more subtle but equally effective. She'd begun including Sarah in conversations that were designed to highlight her social isolation and cultural differences. Questions about Sarah's weekend plans, her family's social connections, and her participation in various academy traditions were delivered with apparent friendliness, while actually emphasizing everything that made Sarah different from her classmates. Harrison's role had been to create the social pressure that would force Sarah to respond to their overtures. He'd begun organizing group activities that included Sarah in ways that made her refusal to participate seem antisocial, while her acceptance would force her into uncomfortable social situations. The invitations were extended publicly, making Sarah's responses visible to other students and creating social pressure that was difficult to resist. The escalation had been gradual but relentless. What began as awkward social pressure had evolved into more direct forms of harassment that still maintained the veneer of plausible deniability. Sarah's careful strategy of invisibility had not only failed to protect her, but had actually made her more vulnerable by isolating her from potential allies and support systems. Their campaign against Sarah had also served as entertainment for other students who were grateful not to be targets themselves. The social dynamics of Westfield Academy created an environment where witnessing someone else's humiliation provided relief from the constant anxiety of potentially becoming the next victim. Sarah's isolation made her a perfect target because her destruction would create no ripple effects that might threaten other students' security. What none of them understood was that their carefully planned campaign was being observed by someone whose understanding of warfare extended far beyond the social battlefields of private school hierarchies. The quiet girl they'd selected as their target possessed resources and protection that existed entirely outside their world of inherited privilege and social manipulation. The stage was set for a collision between two completely different forms of power: the sophisticated social warfare of generational wealth and the uncompromising realities of military justice. Sarah's tormentors had no idea that their perfect victim was about to become the catalyst for a demonstration of consequences that would fundamentally alter the social dynamics of Westfield Academy. The transformation from subtle, psychological pressure to open harassment began on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the autumn air carried the kind of crisp clarity that made Westfield Academy's manicured grounds look like a postcard advertising elite education. Sarah had arrived at her usual time, 17 minutes before first period, and was navigating the main hallway toward her locker when Bryce Kensington's voice cut through the morning quiet with surgical precision. "Sarah Chen," he called out, his tone carrying the kind of false warmth that immediately put Sarah on high alert. "Just the person I was looking for." Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify escape routes, evaluate potential threats. The hallway was nearly empty, except for a few early arriving students and Mrs. Patterson, the elderly secretary who was unlocking classroom doors with methodical efficiency. Bryce stood near the trophy case that displayed decades of Westfield Academy's athletic achievements, his position carefully chosen to block Sarah's most direct path to her locker. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Bryce continued, though they'd had no conversation whatsoever. "About your family's military service. It must be so difficult, having your father deployed overseas while you're trying to navigate high school social dynamics." The comment was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It established Bryce's knowledge of Sarah's personal situation, created the impression of an ongoing relationship between them, and positioned her father's absence as a vulnerability rather than a sacrifice. Sarah recognized the tactical sophistication behind the approach, even as she felt its emotional impact. "I need to get to my locker," Sarah replied quietly, her voice carrying none of the authority that her father's training had taught her to project when facing hostile encounters. The social battlefield of Westfield Academy operated according to rules that made her military-inspired responses seem awkward and inappropriate. "Of course," Bryce said, stepping aside with exaggerated courtesy while somehow managing to make the gesture feel like a dismissal rather than accommodation. "I wouldn't want to make you late for your first period. Though I have to say, your dedication to punctuality is admirable. Very military." The pause before the word military was calculated to transform what should have been a compliment into something that felt vaguely insulting. Sarah had experienced similar verbal gymnastics throughout her military childhood, but the civilian version carried different implications that she was still learning to decode. Victoria Ashworth materialized from a side corridor with timing that was too perfect to be coincidental. Her appearance was as carefully orchestrated as a theatrical entrance, designed to create the impression of casual encounter, while actually representing the next phase of their coordinated campaign. "Bryce, there you are," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of breathless excitement that suggested urgent news. "I was just talking to Madison Walsh about the upcoming winter formal, and she mentioned that the committee is looking for volunteers to help with decorations. Sarah, you'd be perfect for that kind of detailed work." The suggestion was layered with implications that Sarah immediately recognized, but couldn't directly address. Victoria was positioning her as someone whose social status made her suitable for behind-the-scenes labor rather than attendance at the actual event. The comment about detailed work suggested that Sarah's value lay in her ability to perform tasks that others considered beneath their attention. "I haven't really thought about the winter formal," Sarah responded, which was true but sounded defensive in the context of their conversation. Her military upbringing had taught her to be direct and honest, qualities that served her poorly in environments where every statement was evaluated for hidden meanings and social implications. "Oh, that's right," Victoria said, her tone shifting to one of apparent sympathy. "Military families probably don't have much experience with formal social events. It's completely understandable that you'd be nervous about that kind of thing." The observation was designed to highlight Sarah's outsider status while simultaneously offering what appeared to be understanding. Victoria's family had built their media empire on the ability to deliver criticism wrapped in apparent concern, and she'd inherited their talent for making attacks sound like assistance. Harrison Colby's arrival completed their triangle of intimidation, his timing as precisely calculated as everything else in their coordinated assault. He approached from the direction of the library, carrying an armload of books that created the impression of academic seriousness, while actually serving as props in their carefully choreographed performance. "Morning, Sarah," Harrison said, his greeting carrying the kind of analytical attention that made Sarah feel like a specimen being examined under a microscope. I couldn't help but overhear Victoria mentioning the winter formal. It's really one of the highlights of the Westfield Academy social calendar, the kind of event that helps define your entire high school experience. The comment was designed to emphasize everything that Sarah was missing by remaining outside their social circle. Harrison's analytical mind had identified her fear of social isolation as a pressure point that could be exploited through strategic inclusion and exclusion. The winter formal represented exactly the kind of social milestone that could be used to demonstrate her outsider status. "I'm sure it's very nice," Sarah replied, her voice growing quieter as she found herself surrounded by 3 students whose combined social power could reshape her entire high school experience. The hallway had begun to fill with arriving students, creating an audience for whatever performance Bryce, Victoria, and Harrison were preparing to deliver. "Nice?" Bryce repeated, his tone suggesting that Sarah's response revealed fundamental misunderstanding about the event's significance. The winter formal is a tradition that goes back to the founding of Westfield Academy. It's not just nice, it's a rite of passage that connects current students to generations of alumni who've gone on to shape American society. The historical reference was designed to emphasize the institutional weight behind their social traditions, while simultaneously highlighting Sarah's family's recent arrival and temporary connection to the community. Bryce's knowledge of the Academy's history wasn't accidental. It was weaponized information designed to reinforce his family's multi-generational connection to the institution. "My great-grandfather attended the very first winter formal in 1923. Victoria added, her contribution building on Bryce's foundation while adding another layer of inherited legitimacy. "He met my great-grandmother there, actually. It's amazing how these events create connections that last for generations." The story was probably true, but its inclusion in their conversation served to emphasize the dynastic nature of their social connections while highlighting the temporary nature of military families' relationships to any particular community. Sarah's father might be serving his country, but he wasn't building the kind of generational roots that created lasting social power. "Of course, not everyone feels comfortable at formal events," Harrison observed, his tone carrying the kind of clinical objectivity that made his comments feel like academic observations rather than personal attacks. "It takes a certain kind of confidence to navigate complex social situations, especially when you're not familiar with the unwritten rules that govern these interactions." The comment was designed to present Sarah's social isolation as a character flaw rather than a survival strategy. Harrison's understanding of human psychology allowed him to identify and exploit the gap between Sarah's actual capabilities and her social performance, creating doubt about her fundamental competence. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being surrounded by predators who understood the terrain better than she did. Her military training had taught her to recognize tactical disadvantages, but it hadn't prepared her for the kind of warfare that left no physical evidence while systematically destroying her psychological defenses. "I should get to class," Sarah said, attempting to extract herself from the conversation before it escalated further. Her strategic retreat was the correct tactical response, but it also represented a victory for her tormentors who had successfully demonstrated their ability to make her uncomfortable in public spaces. "Of course," Bryce replied, his tone carrying the kind of dismissive politeness that made Sarah's departure seem like a failure rather than a choice. "We wouldn't want to keep you from your studies. Academic achievement is so important for students who don't have other advantages." The final comment was designed to land after Sarah had already begun walking away, ensuring that she would hear it, but wouldn't be able to respond without seeming confrontational. The reference to other advantages encompassed everything from social connections to family wealth, to the kind of cultural capital that made navigating elite environments feel natural rather than threatening. As Sarah walked toward her locker, she could hear the 3 of them continuing their conversation in voices that were just loud enough to ensure she would catch fragments of their discussion. They were talking about weekend plans that involved private clubs, family connections, and social events that existed entirely outside her world of military discipline and modest base housing. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes, but it had accomplished multiple strategic objectives. Sarah's isolation had been highlighted for other students to observe. Her social anxiety had been triggered in a public setting, and her outsider status had been reinforced through references to traditions and connections that she couldn't access or understand. What made the harassment particularly effective was its apparent friendliness. Any observer would have seen three popular students making an effort to include a quiet classmate in their conversation. The psychological damage was invisible to outside observers while being devastating to Sarah's already fragile sense of security. The pattern would repeat throughout the day, with each encounter building on the previous one while maintaining the facade of social inclusion. Sarah found herself caught in a web of interactions that felt increasingly threatening, while remaining impossible to categorize as actual harassment. By the end of the school day, Sarah's carefully constructed defense mechanisms were showing signs of strain. Her strategy of invisibility had not only failed to protect her, but had actually made her more vulnerable by isolating her from potential allies and support systems. The quiet girl who had learned to navigate military bases around the world was discovering that some battles required different kinds of courage than she'd been taught to possess. The sanctuary of Sarah's carefully constructed safe spaces began to crumble on a Thursday afternoon in November, when the overcast sky cast Westfield Academy's Gothic architecture in shades of gray that matched her increasingly dark mood. The library, which had served as her primary refuge since arriving at the academy, was about to become another battlefield in the escalating war that Bryce, Victoria, and Harrison had declared against her existence. Sarah had claimed her usual table in the library's northeast corner, positioned between the biography section and the periodicals archive, where the afternoon light filtered through tall windows that overlooked the academy's memorial garden. The location provided multiple advantages: good natural lighting for extended reading, visual access to the library's main entrance, and enough distance from high-traffic areas to discourage casual interruptions. Mrs. Wellington, the head librarian, had grown accustomed to Sarah's presence and had begun leaving particularly interesting new acquisitions on the nearby shelf as a quiet form of encouragement. The research paper on World War II Pacific theater operations had given Sarah a legitimate reason to spend her study hall period surrounded by military histories and primary source documents. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was researching her grandfather's war while fighting her own battle against enemies who wielded social manipulation instead of conventional weapons. Colonel Chen's father had survived the Bataan Death March and the liberation of the Philippines, experiences that put her current struggles into perspective, while also making her feel ashamed of her inability to handle privileged teenagers. Victoria Ashworth's entrance into the library was announced by the soft click of her designer heels against the polished hardwood floors, a sound that had become as recognizable to Sarah as air raid sirens had been to her grandfather's generation. Victoria moved through the library stacks with the confident stride of someone who had never been denied access to any space or resource, her presence transforming the quiet sanctuary into a stage for whatever performance she had planned. "Sarah, what a pleasant surprise," Victoria announced, her voice carrying just enough volume to attract attention from other students without violating the library's noise policies. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I realized I might have been too subtle about something important." The opening gambit was designed to establish the fiction of an ongoing relationship while creating anxiety about conversations that Sarah couldn't remember having. Victoria's media family had taught her that controlling the narrative was more important than adhering to facts, and she applied these lessons to her social interactions with devastating effectiveness. "I don't think we had a conversation yesterday," Sarah replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to maintain the library's atmosphere of scholarly tranquility. Her military training had taught her to challenge false statements, but the social dynamics of Westfield Academy made direct contradiction seem rude rather than accurate. "Oh, but we did," Victoria insisted, her tone carrying the kind of patient correction that teachers used with confused students. After chemistry class, when you were struggling with the pH calculations, I offered to help you understand the concepts, but you seemed overwhelmed. The fabricated memory was crafted with enough specific details to create doubt about Sarah's own recollections while positioning Victoria as a helpful classmate whose assistance had been rejected. Other students in the library had begun to notice their conversation, creating an audience for whatever lesson Victoria was preparing to deliver. Harrison Colby materialized from behind the reference desk with timing that confirmed the coordinated nature of their assault. He carried a stack of economics journals that provided a plausible reason for his presence, while actually serving as props in their carefully orchestrated performance. His approach was calculated to create the impression of casual encounter, while actually representing the next phase of their psychological warfare. "Victoria, there you are," Harrison said, his voice carrying the kind of relief that suggested he'd been searching for her. "I was just telling Mr. Davidson about your family scholarship program, and he mentioned that applications are due next week. Sarah, you should definitely apply. It's specifically designed for students from challenging backgrounds." The suggestion was layered with implications that Sarah immediately recognized but couldn't directly address without seeming ungrateful. Harrison was positioning her as someone whose family's financial situation made her dependent on charity, while simultaneously offering what appeared to be helpful assistance. The reference to challenging backgrounds encompassed everything from economic hardship to social isolation to the temporary nature of military families' community connections. "I'm not familiar with that scholarship program," Sarah replied, her voice growing even quieter as she found herself surrounded by students whose combined social power could reshape her entire academic experience. The library had begun to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap, with other students watching their interaction with the kind of fascinated attention that car accidents attracted. "Oh, it's quite prestigious," Victoria explained, her tone suggesting that Sarah's ignorance revealed fundamental gaps in her understanding of available opportunities. "The Ashworth Foundation provides full tuition assistance to students whose families have made significant sacrifices for public service. Military families are given special consideration, of course." The explanation was designed to emphasize Sarah's outsider status while simultaneously highlighting Victoria's family's generous support for worthy causes. The reference to significant sacrifices made Colonel Chen's military service sound like a form of noble poverty that required charitable intervention from families like the Ashworths. Bryce, Kensington's arrival completed their triangulation of Sarah's position, his entrance timed to coincide with the maximum psychological impact of their coordinated assault. He approached from the direction of the computer terminals, carrying a tablet that created the impression of academic research while actually serving as a prop in their carefully choreographed performance. "Perfect timing," Bryce announced, his voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm that suggested exciting news. "I was just reviewing the winter formal committee assignments, and Sarah's name came up for the decoration subcommittee. It's exactly the kind of detailed work that would showcase her particular talents." The committee assignment was presented as an honor while actually representing another form of social segregation. Bryce was positioning Sarah as someone whose value lay in her ability to perform behind-the-scenes labor rather than participate in the actual social event. The pause before particular talents suggested that her skills were specialized in ways that made her unsuitable for more visible roles. "I haven't volunteered for any committees," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of the authority that her father's training had taught her to project when facing hostile encounters. The social battlefield of Westfield Academy made her military-inspired. Responses seemed inappropriate, but her stress was beginning to override her carefully constructed civilian persona. "Oh, but you don't need to volunteer," Victoria explained, her tone carrying the kind of patient instruction that adults used with confused children. Students with your academic profile are automatically considered for service opportunities. It's part of Westfield Academy's commitment to developing well-rounded citizens. The explanation transformed what should have been student choice into institutional obligation while making Sarah's reluctance seem like resistance to character development. Victoria's understanding of bureaucratic language allowed her to make assignments sound like opportunities while actually representing another form of social control. Harrison's contribution built on Victoria's foundation while adding another layer of psychological pressure. "The decorations committee is actually quite an honor," he observed, his tone carrying the kind of analytical objectivity that made his comments feel like academic observations rather than personal attacks. "It requires attention to detail, reliability, and the ability to work well under supervision. Perfect for someone with your background." The pause before background encompassed everything from her military upbringing to her family's modest circumstances to her social isolation. Harrison was presenting qualities that should have been strengths as indicators of her suitability for subordinate roles rather than leadership positions. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being surrounded by predators who understood the terrain better than she did. Her military training had taught her to recognize tactical disadvantages, but it hadn't prepared her for the kind of warfare that left no physical evidence, while systematically destroying her psychological defenses. The library, which had been her primary refuge, was being transformed into another battlefield where her enemies held every advantage. "I need to finish my research," Sarah said, attempting to extract herself from the conversation before it escalated. Further, her strategic retreat was the correct tactical response, but it also represented a victory for her tormentors who had successfully invaded her safe space and made her uncomfortable in an environment that should have provided security. "Of course," Bryce replied, his tone carrying the kind of dismissive politeness that made Sarah's departure seem like a failure rather than a choice. "We wouldn't want to interrupt your studies. Academic achievement is so important for students who need to distinguish themselves through merit rather than connections." The final comment was designed to land after Sarah had already begun gathering her books, ensuring that she would hear it, but wouldn't be able to respond without seeming confrontational. The reference to distinguishing herself through merit rather than connections highlighted everything that made her different from her classmates, while making her father's military service sound like a limitation rather than an achievement. As Sarah packed her research materials, she could hear the three of them continuing their conversation in voices that were just loud enough to ensure she would catch fragments of their discussion. They were talking about family vacation plans that involved private resorts, cultural events that required special invitations, and social connections that existed entirely outside her world of military discipline and modest base housing. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had accomplished multiple strategic objectives. Sarah's primary safe space had been invaded and compromised. Her isolation had been highlighted for other students to observe, and her outsider status had been reinforced through references to programs and opportunities that she couldn't access or understand. What made the harassment particularly effective was its apparent helpfulness. Any observer would have seen three popular students making an effort to include a quiet classmate in various school activities. The psychological damage was invisible to outside observers while being devastating to Sarah's already fragile sense of security. The pattern would continue throughout the following days, with each encounter building on the previous one while maintaining the facade of social inclusion. Sarah found herself caught in a web of interactions that felt increasingly threatening while remaining impossible to categorize as actual harassment. Her carefully constructed defense mechanisms were showing signs of strain, and her enemies were beginning to sense that complete victory was within their reach. The breaking point arrived on a Friday afternoon in December, when the early winter darkness had already begun to settle over Westfield Academy's snow-dusted campus, and most Students had departed for their weekend plans involving country clubs, family estates, and social events that existed entirely outside Sarah's experience. The nearly empty parking lot should have provided the kind of isolation that Sarah normally craved. But today it felt ominous rather than peaceful, like the calm before a storm that her military training had taught her to recognize and fear. Sarah had remained after school to complete her mandatory volunteer hours in the library, helping Mrs. Wellington reorganize the reference section and update the card catalog system that the elderly librarians still preferred to the digital alternatives. The work was methodical and soothing, providing the kind of structured activity that had always helped Sarah manage stress and anxiety. She'd lost track of time among the dusty volumes and careful filing systems, emerging into the December afternoon to discover that the parking lot had transformed into a nearly deserted landscape of scattered vehicles and lengthening shadows. Honda Civic sat in the far corner of the student parking area, positioned there by choice rather than necessity because Sarah preferred the privacy that came with distance from the main traffic patterns. The walk across the empty asphalt gave her time to process the day's events and prepare mentally for the weekend ahead, when she could finally relax her constant vigilance and exist without the exhausting hyper-awareness that had become her normal state of being. The sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel made Sarah's head turn, her military-trained instincts immediately assessing the situation and identifying potential threats. Bryce Kensington was walking toward her from the direction of the athletic building, his letterman jacket zipped against the cold, and his confident stride suggesting that this encounter was planned rather than coincidental. Behind him, Victoria Ashworth emerged from behind a row of expensive vehicles, her designer coat and perfectly styled hair creating a stark contrast with the industrial setting of the parking lot. "Sarah Chen," Bryce called out, his voice carrying across the empty space with the kind of authority that he'd never had to earn but had always possessed. "Perfect timing. We were just talking about you." The statement was designed to create immediate anxiety while establishing that Sarah had been the subject of discussions that occurred without her knowledge or participation. Bryce's tone carried the kind of casual confidence that suggested he had every right to discuss her life and circumstances with anyone he chose, reflecting the privileged assumption that other people's privacy was negotiable rather than absolute. Harrison Colby materialized from behind Sarah's own vehicle, his positioning revealing the coordinated nature of their approach and eliminating her most obvious escape route. He carried a tablet and wore the kind of focused expression that suggested serious business, creating an atmosphere of formality that made the parking lot feel like a boardroom where Sarah was about to face some kind of judgment or evaluation. "We've been reviewing your progress at Westfield Academy," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the kind of clinical objectivity that made his observations sound like official assessments rather than personal opinions. "Your academic performance has been adequate, but your social integration has been disappointing." The word disappointing was delivered with the kind of emphasis that suggested Sarah had failed to meet expectations that she'd never been informed about. Harrison's analytical approach to human behavior allowed him to identify and exploit the gap between Sarah's actual capabilities and her social performance, creating doubt about her fundamental worthiness as a member of their community. "I don't understand what you mean," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a hint of the authority that her father's training had taught her to project when facing hostile encounters. The social battlefield of Westfield Academy made her military-inspired responses seem inappropriate, but her stress was beginning to override her carefully constructed civilian persona. "Oh, but you do understand," Victoria interjected, her tone carrying the kind of patient correction that teachers used with students who were being deliberately obtuse. "You've been at this school for almost 2 years, and you've made no meaningful connections, contributed nothing to school spirit, and generally acted as if you're too good for the rest of us." The accusation was crafted to transform Sarah's survival strategy into evidence of arrogance while positioning her isolation as a choice rather than a consequence of their systematic harassment. Victoria's media family had taught her that controlling the narrative was more important than adhering to facts, and she applied these lessons to reframe Sarah's victimization as antisocial behavior. "That's not true," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that her father had taught her to channel into focused resistance. "I've never acted like I'm too good for anyone. I just try to keep to myself and focus on my studies." "Exactly," Bryce replied, his tone suggesting that Sarah had just proven his point rather than defended herself. "You keep to yourself instead of participating in the community that your parents are paying to join. You focus on your studies instead of developing the social skills that will actually matter in the real world." The response was designed to reframe Sarah's academic dedication as antisocial behavior while positioning their harassment as an attempt to help her develop necessary life skills. Bryce's understanding of social dynamics allowed him to present their cruelty as a form of tough love that would ultimately benefit their victim. "My father isn't paying for me to join a community," Sarah replied, her voice carrying more authority. Now she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "He's paying for me to get an education that will prepare me for college and a career. Social skills can be developed anywhere, but academic credentials are permanent." The statement represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how privilege operated in their world. Sarah's focus on meritocracy and academic achievement reflected her military family's values, but it also revealed her ignorance of the social networks that actually determine success in elite environments. Her response provided her tormentors with additional ammunition for their psychological warfare. "How quaint," Victoria observed, her tone carrying the kind of condescending amusement that adults used when children made naive statements about how the world worked. "You actually believe that grades matter more than connections. That's so middle class." The final phrase was delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that reflected generations of inherited superiority. Victoria's family had never needed to worry about academic performance because their social connections provided opportunities that were unavailable to people who relied on merit alone. Her comment was designed to highlight the fundamental difference between Sarah's worldview and the reality of how power operated in their society. Harrison's contribution built on Victoria's foundation while adding another layer of psychological pressure. "The problem is that you're treating Westfield Academy like a public school," he observed, his tone carrying the kind of analytical objectivity that made his comments feel like academic observations rather than personal attacks. "You're focusing on individual achievement instead of understanding that success here depends on integration into existing social structures." The observation was accurate but cruel, highlighting Sarah's outsider status while making her military family's values seem naive and inappropriate for their environment. Harrison's understanding of institutional dynamics allowed him to identify the fundamental mismatch between Sarah's approach to education and the social realities of elite private schools. "I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone," Sarah said, her voice beginning to show signs of the strain that came from defending positions that felt increasingly untenable. "I just want to finish high school and move on to college. I don't need to be part of your social structure." "But you see, that's where you're wrong," Bryce replied, his tone shifting from casual conversation to something more serious and threatening. "You are part of our social structure whether you want to be or not. The question is whether you're going to accept your place in it willingly or whether we're going to have to teach you some lessons about how things work around here." The threat was delivered with the kind of calm authority that suggested Bryce had every right to determine Sarah's place in their social hierarchy. His family's multi-generational connection to Westfield Academy gave him a sense of ownership over the institution that extended to controlling the behavior of students who didn't understand their role in the established order. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being surrounded by predators who understood the terrain better than she did. But this time the encounter was taking place in an isolated location where no teachers or other adults were present to provide even the illusion of protection. The parking lot had become a courtroom where she was being judged according to rules that she'd never been allowed to understand or influence. What kind of lessons? Sarah asked, her voice carrying a hint of the defiance that her father's training had taught her to project when facing enemies who had revealed their true intentions. The social battlefield of Westfield Academy was about to become something more dangerous, and her military instincts were beginning to override her civilian persona. "Oh, nothing too dramatic," Victoria replied, her tone carrying the kind of false reassurance that made her words sound more threatening than direct statements would have been. "Just some practical education about the consequences of antisocial behavior and the importance of understanding your place in the community." The euphemistic language was designed to obscure the true nature of their intentions while making their threats sound like reasonable responses to Sarah's supposed misconduct. Victoria's media family had taught her that controlling language was essential to controlling perception, and she applied these lessons to make their planned harassment sound like justified intervention. Harrison's final contribution completed their coordination while escalating the psychological pressure to unbearable levels. "The thing about military families," he observed, his tone carrying the kind of clinical analysis that made his comments feel like academic research rather than personal attacks, "is that they're temporary. Your father will be transferred eventually, and you'll move on to terrorize some other school with your antisocial behavior. But until then, you're our problem to solve." The statement was designed to highlight the temporary nature of Sarah's connection to their community while positioning her as a problem that required their intervention. Harrison's understanding of military life allowed him to weaponize Sarah's family service against her, transforming their sacrifice into evidence of her fundamental unsuitability for their environment. Sarah stood surrounded by 3 students whose combined social power could destroy her remaining time at Westfield Academy. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than fear. The combination of isolation, escalating threats, and direct challenges to her family's honor had triggered something deeper than her civilian survival instincts. Her father's training was beginning to surface, and with it came the realization that some battles couldn't be won through retreat and avoidance. The quiet girl, who had spent 2 years trying to remain invisible, was about to discover that visibility wasn't always a weakness, and that some forms of protection existed entirely outside the social hierarchies that her tormentors had mistaken for absolute power. The transformation that overcame Sarah Chen in that empty parking lot was as sudden and complete as a switch being flipped in her neural circuitry. The months of careful civilian camouflage fell away like a discarded costume, revealing the steel core that Colonel James Chen had been forging in his daughter since she could walk. Her posture straightened with military precision, her shoulders squared with the kind of confidence that came from genetic memory of warriors, and her eyes took on the focused intensity that her father's colleagues would have recognized immediately. "You made a mistake," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a register that carried across the empty parking lot with unmistakable authority. The transformation was so complete that Bryce, Victoria, and Harrison actually stepped back involuntarily, their predatory instincts suddenly recognizing that the dynamics of their encounter had shifted in ways they couldn't understand or control before any of them could respond. Sarah pulled out her phone with movements that were deliberate and measured rather than frantic or desperate. Her fingers moved across the screen with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested she'd performed this action many times before, though none of her tormentors could have imagined the circumstances under which she'd been trained to make such calls. "Dad," Sarah said when the call connected, her voice carrying the kind of crisp professionalism that military families used for official communications. "I need you to come to Westfield Academy immediately. We have a situation that requires your attention." The conversation that followed was brief, conducted in the kind of coded language that military families develop for communicating sensitive information over potentially monitored channels. Sarah's responses were limited to "yes, sir," "understood," and "standing by." But the tone of her voice and the precision of her language created an atmosphere of impending consequence that made her three tormentors increasingly uncomfortable. "What are you doing?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the kind of outraged authority that suggested Sarah had violated some fundamental rule of their engagement. The media heiress had grown up understanding that information was power, but she'd never encountered someone who possessed access to information networks that existed entirely outside her family's sphere of influence. "I'm solving a problem," Sarah replied, her tone carrying the kind of calm certainty that suggested she was following established protocols rather than making desperate improvisations. "My father taught me that when civilian authority fails to address harassment and intimidation, military resources become available for protecting dependents." The statement was delivered with the kind of matter-of-fact authority that made it sound like established policy rather than personal threat. Sarah's military upbringing had taught her that power came in many forms, and that social hierarchies were temporary constructs that could be dissolved by higher authorities when circumstances required intervention. Bryce's response revealed the first crack in his confident facade. "You can't just call your daddy every time someone hurts your feelings," he said, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. The golden boy who had never questioned his place in the world was beginning to understand that some forms of power existed entirely outside the social structures that had always protected him. "This isn't about hurt feelings," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of clinical precision that Harrison had attempted to use against her. "This is about a documented pattern of harassment, intimidation, and threats that has escalated to the point where my safety and well-being are at risk. Military dependents have access to resources and protections that civilian families don't understand or appreciate." The explanation was delivered with the kind of professional objectivity that suggested Sarah was reading from a manual rather than making emotional responses to their provocation. Her father's training had taught her to document incidents, analyze patterns, and respond to threats with appropriate levels of force and authority. Harrison's analytical mind was the first to recognize the implications of Sarah's transformation. "What kind of resources?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that suggested he was beginning to understand that their carefully planned harassment campaign had triggered consequences they hadn't anticipated. "The kind that exists to protect military families from threats that local authorities can't or won't address," Sarah replied, her tone carrying the kind of calm certainty that suggested she was accessing knowledge that her civilian classmates couldn't comprehend. "My father has spent his career dealing with people who mistake temporary advantages for permanent power." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation, the low rumble of powerful engines suggesting that Sarah's phone call had summoned more than just paternal concern. The parking lot's entrance was suddenly illuminated by the headlights of three black SUVs that moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military rather than civilian operation. Victoria's voice carried the first hint of genuine fear as she watched the vehicles approach. "Who did you call?" she demanded, her media family's instincts recognizing that they were about to become part of a story rather than controlling the narrative they'd been writing. "I told you," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the kind of patient explanation that adults used with children who were slow to understand important concepts. "I called my father, Colonel James Chen, United States Army, currently assigned to the Joint Chiefs of Staff Liaison Office at the Pentagon." The revelation hit her three tormentors like a physical blow, the implications of Sarah's family connections finally becoming clear. They'd spent months tormenting someone whose father possessed the kind of institutional power that made their family's local influence seem trivial and temporary by comparison. The lead SUV came to a stop directly in front of their group. Its positioning calculated to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining professional restraint. The door opened to reveal a man whose presence immediately commanded attention and respect, his military bearing evident in every movement, despite his civilian clothing. Colonel James Chen stepped out of the vehicle with the kind of controlled grace that suggested coiled power rather than casual movement. At 45, he possessed the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of military service in hostile environments, his eyes scanning the parking lot with the automatic threat assessment that had become second nature during multiple combat deployments. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that suggested he was completely in control of the situation, despite its apparent complexity. "Are you unharmed?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her response carrying the kind of crisp professionalism that suggested this was familiar territory rather than an unprecedented crisis. "These are the 3 students I've been documenting in my incident reports." The exchange revealed the existence of a communication system that had been operating parallel to the school's official channels, creating a record of harassment that existed entirely outside the social structures that Bryce, Victoria, and Harrison had been manipulating. Sarah's apparent isolation had been camouflage for a different kind of protection system. Colonel Chen's attention turned to the 3 students who had been tormenting his daughter, his gaze carrying the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was conducting a tactical assessment rather than casual observation. "I believe you 3 have something to discuss with me," he said, his tone carrying the kind of inevitable authority that suggested resistance was futile rather than simply inadvisable. The quiet girl, who had spent months trying to remain invisible, had finally revealed the true source of her power, and her tormentors were about to discover that some forms of protection existed entirely outside the social hierarchies they'd mistaken for absolute authority. The 2 men who emerged from the second SUV moved with the kind of silent efficiency that suggested decades of experience in situations where precision mattered more than protocol. They positioned themselves at strategic points around the parking lot, their civilian clothing unable to disguise the military bearing that marked them as Colonel Chen's colleagues rather than casual observers. Their presence transformed the Westfield Academy parking lot from a teenage confrontation into something resembling a military operation. Bryce Kensington's confident facade crumbled completely as he found himself face to face with a man whose authority derived from something more substantial than inherited wealth or social connections. Colonel Chen's presence radiated the kind of competence that came from making life-and-death decisions in hostile environments, creating an atmosphere where teenage social hierarchies seemed suddenly irrelevant and powerless. "Colonel Chen," Bryce began, his voice carrying the kind of nervous politeness that suggested he was trying to restore some semblance of the social dynamics he understood. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. We were just having a conversation with Sarah about school activities." The explanation was delivered with the kind of desperate reasonableness that suggested Bryce was beginning to understand that his normal advantages, family connections, social status, institutional protection, might not apply in this new context. Colonel Chen's response was immediate and devastating in its quiet authority. "Mr. Kensington," Colonel Chen replied, his tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound more threatening than direct hostility. "I've been reading my daughter's incident reports for the past 3 months. Your conversations have been documented, analyzed, and forwarded to appropriate authorities. This is not a misunderstanding." The revelation that Sarah had been systematically documenting their harassment campaign sent shockwaves through the 3 students who had believed their sophisticated psychological warfare left no evidence. Victoria's media family had taught her to control information flow, But she'd never encountered someone who possessed the kind of institutional resources that made private school politics seem like children's games. What kind of incident reports? Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the kind of outraged authority that suggested she had every right to know what information was being collected about her activities. Her family's media empire had given her an understanding of how information could be weaponized, but she'd never been on the receiving end of intelligence-gathering operations. Colonel Chen's response revealed the existence of a parallel documentation system that had been operating without their knowledge or consent. The kind that military families use to protect their dependents from threats that local authorities can't or won't address, he explained, his tone carrying the kind of matter-of-fact authority that suggested this was established procedure rather than personal vendetta. Every incident of harassment has been recorded, corroborated, and filed with appropriate military and civilian authorities. Your family's lawyers are probably receiving notification of pending investigations as we speak. The statement hit the three students like a physical blow, the implications of their months-long harassment campaign finally becoming clear. They'd been playing a game whose rules they understood while their victim had been fighting a war according to protocols they'd never imagined existed. Harrison Colby's analytical mind was the first to recognize the full scope of their situation. "You can't do this," he said, his voice carrying the kind of desperate logic that suggested he was trying to find loopholes in a system he didn't understand. "This is a civilian matter. Schools have their own disciplinary procedures." "Mr. Colby," Colonel Chen replied, his tone carrying the kind of patient explanation that suggested he was dealing with someone who didn't understand basic concepts. "When civilian institutions fail to protect military dependents from systematic harassment, federal authorities have jurisdiction. Your family's influence over local school boards doesn't extend to military justice systems." The explanation revealed the existence of protection mechanisms that existed entirely outside the social structures that had always shielded the three students from consequences. Their family's wealth and connections had created a bubble of privilege that was about to be punctured by authorities who operated according to different rules and different priorities. "My father is on the school's board of trustees," Bryce said, his voice carrying the kind of desperate authority that suggested he was trying to invoke protections that had always worked in the past. "He's contributed millions of dollars to this school. You can't just ignore established procedures." Colonel Chen's response was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that suggested he was accessing knowledge that civilian families couldn't comprehend. "Your father's contributions to Westfield Academy are noted in our files," he said, his tone carrying the kind of professional objectivity that suggested he was reading from official documents. "So are his business relationships with defense contractors, his family's tax obligations, and his company's compliance with federal regulations." The revelation that their family's activities had been subject to military intelligence gathering sent another wave of shock through the three students. They'd assumed that their harassment of Sarah was a private matter that would be resolved through familiar social channels, but they were discovering that military families possessed resources and protections that existed entirely outside their understanding. Victoria's voice carried genuine fear for the first time as she began to understand the implications of their situation. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her media family's instincts recognizing that they were no longer controlling the narrative, but were instead becoming subjects of someone else's story. "I want you to understand that your actions have consequences," Colonel Chen replied, his tone carrying the kind of inevitable authority that suggested resistance was futile rather than simply inadvisable. "Military families serve this country with the understanding that their sacrifice protects civilians from threats they can't handle alone. When civilians turn that protection into vulnerability, different rules apply." The philosophical framework that Colonel Chen was articulating revealed the fundamental difference between military and civilian approaches to justice. His daughter's harassment hadn't just been a school disciplinary issue. It had been an attack on a military family that triggered protective mechanisms designed to operate beyond civilian authority. "What happens now?" Harrison asked, his analytical mind recognizing that they were facing consequences that extended far beyond school disciplinary procedures. The three students who had believed themselves untouchable were discovering that some forms of power existed entirely outside their family spheres of influence. "Now you'll learn about accountability," Colonel Chen replied, his tone carrying the kind of calm certainty that suggested he was following established protocols rather than making personal decisions. "Your families will receive comprehensive documentation of your harassment campaign, along with recommendations for appropriate consequences. Your school will implement new policies to protect military dependents from future incidents." The systematic nature of Colonel Chen's response revealed the existence of institutional mechanisms that had been triggered by their harassment campaign. Sarah's apparent isolation had been camouflage for a different kind of protection system that operated according to military rather than civilian principles. "And if we apologize?" Bryce asked, his voice carrying the kind of desperate negotiation that suggested he was trying to find some way to restore the social dynamics he understood. His family's wealth had always provided escape routes from consequences, but he was discovering that some authorities operated according to different priorities. Colonel Chen's final response carried the weight of institutional authority that made teenage social hierarchies seem suddenly irrelevant. "Apologies are noted, Mr. Kensington," he said, his tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound more final than direct threats. "But consequences are determined by actions, not words. You chose to target a military dependent. Now you'll learn what that choice means." The transformation that swept through Westfield Academy in the weeks following Colonel Chen's intervention was as swift and comprehensive as a military operation, touching every aspect of the school's culture and leaving no corner of the institution unchanged. The three students who had terrorized Sarah Chen discovered that their carefully constructed social empire was built on foundations far more fragile than they had ever imagined, and that some forms of power could dissolve overnight when confronted by authorities who operated according to different rules entirely. Bryce Kensington's fall from grace was particularly spectacular, given the heights from which he tumbled. The golden boy who had commanded attention through inherited charisma found himself suddenly invisible, his former admirers avoiding him with the same strategic precision that Sarah had once used to avoid them. The lacrosse team that had once followed his leadership now treated him with the kind of professional distance that suggested they were following orders from higher authorities rather than making personal choices about association. The Kensington family's legal team had worked frantically to contain the damage from Colonel Chen's systematic documentation, but they discovered that military justice systems operated according to principles that made civilian legal maneuvering seem ineffective and irrelevant. The harassment campaign that had seemed like harmless teenage social dynamics when viewed through the lens of private school privilege took on sinister implications when analyzed by federal authorities trained to recognize patterns of systematic intimidation. Victoria Ashworth's media family had initially attempted to control the narrative surrounding the incident, using their newspaper and television holdings to frame the story as an overreaction by military authorities to normal teenage social interactions. However, their efforts were undermined by the comprehensive nature of Colonel Chen's documentation, which provided a detailed record of harassment that was impossible to dismiss or reframe as innocent misunderstanding. The Ashworth family's media empire had always derived its power from controlling information flow, but they discovered that military intelligence gathering operated according to standards that made their journalistic resources seem amateur and inadequate. Every incident that Sarah had documented was corroborated by multiple sources, creating a legal and public relations nightmare that threatened to damage their family's reputation far beyond the immediate consequences of their daughter's actions. Harrison Colby's analytical mind had initially sought to find loopholes in the military justice system, but his research revealed that federal authorities possessed jurisdiction over crimes against military dependents that superseded local and state protections. His family's investment banking fortune had always provided sophisticated legal protection, but they were discovering that some forms of accountability existed entirely outside the financial systems they understood and controlled. The three families' attempts to use their collective influence to minimize consequences were systematically neutralized by authorities who operated according to different priorities and possessed different resources. Phone calls to school board members were met with references to federal investigations that had placed the matter beyond local jurisdiction. Attempts to influence media coverage were countered by official statements that carried the weight of institutional authority rather than family preference. Sarah Chun's transformation from victim to protected military dependent had ripple effects that extended far beyond her immediate tormentors. Other students who had witnessed her harassment began to understand that the social hierarchies they had accepted as natural and immutable were actually temporary constructs that could be dissolved by higher authorities when circumstances required intervention. The quiet girl who had spent months trying to remain invisible had become a symbol of something that her classmates had never encountered: the idea that some forms of protection existed entirely outside the social structures that governed their daily lives. Students who had previously ignored Sarah began offering tentative gestures of friendship, though she remained cautious about accepting overtures that might be motivated by fear rather than genuine connection. Teachers who had overlooked the systematic harassment of a military dependent discovered that their professional obligations extended beyond maintaining classroom order to protect students whose families served the country. The faculty received comprehensive training on recognizing signs of harassment against military dependents, along with protocols for reporting incidents to appropriate authorities rather than handling them through normal school disciplinary procedures. Mrs. Wellington, the elderly librarian who had quietly supported Sarah through her darkest months, found herself appointed as the school's liaison for military families, a position that carried both authority and responsibility for ensuring that future incidents would be identified and addressed before they escalated to the level that had triggered federal intervention. The winter formal that had been used as a weapon against Sarah's social integration was transformed into an opportunity for the school to demonstrate its commitment to protecting all students regardless of their family backgrounds or social connections. The event that had once represented the pinnacle of Westfield Academy's social hierarchy became a carefully monitored occasion where every student was welcome and protected. Bryce, Victoria, and Harrison's absence from the formal was noted by everyone but discussed by no one, their former classmates having learned that some topics were too dangerous to explore through casual conversation. The three students who had once commanded attention through social dominance had become cautionary tales about the consequences of mistaking temporary advantages for permanent power. The broader implications of Colonel Chen's intervention extended beyond Westfield Academy to other elite institutions where military families sent their children. Private schools throughout the region received new guidelines for protecting military dependents, along with training protocols that emphasized the federal jurisdictions that applied when civilian authorities failed to address systematic harassment. Sarah's academic performance, which had suffered during the months of harassment, began to recover as she found herself able to focus on studies rather than survival. Her participation in class discussions increased as she discovered that her insights were valued rather than dismissed, and her confidence grew as she realized that her military background provided advantages rather than limitations in academic environments. The documentation system that had protected Sarah became a model for other military families, creating networks of communication and support that operated parallel to civilian school systems. Parents who had previously felt powerless to protect their children from elite private school social dynamics discovered that their military service provided resources and protections that existed entirely outside traditional educational hierarchies. Colonel Chen's intervention had achieved more than protecting his daughter. It had established precedents and procedures that would protect future military dependents from similar harassment. The quiet girl who had spent months trying to remain invisible had become the catalyst for systemic changes that would reshape how elite institutions treated military families. The transformation of Westfield Academy from a place where privilege protected predators to an institution where all students were genuinely safe represented a victory that extended far beyond one family's struggle. Sarah Chen had discovered that some battles required different kinds of courage than she had been taught to possess, but she had also learned that true strength came from understanding when to fight and when to summon reinforcements who possessed the authority to achieve lasting change. The spring semester at Westfield Academy unfolded with the kind of careful normalcy that follows seismic shifts in established power structures, as students and faculty alike learned to navigate a social landscape that had been fundamentally altered by Colonel Chen's intervention. Sarah Chen walked through hallways that had once felt like enemy territory with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that true security came not from invisibility, but from understanding the resources and protections that existed beyond the immediate battlefield. Her academic performance had not merely recovered, but flourished in ways that surprised even her most supportive teachers. The energy that had once been consumed by constant vigilance and survival planning was now channeled into intellectual pursuits that revealed the depth of her capabilities. Her contributions to class discussions carried the kind of analytical precision that her father's training had instilled, combined with perspectives that reflected her unique position as both military dependent and survivor of systematic harassment. Scholarship opportunities that had once seemed impossible began materializing as word of her resilience and academic excellence spread through networks that existed entirely outside Westfield Academy's traditional channels. Military academies, universities with strong ROTC programs, and institutions that specifically valued the leadership potential of military dependents began reaching out with offers that recognized her character as much as her grades. Sarah's relationship with her father had evolved through their shared experience of confronting civilian authorities who had failed to protect military families. Colonel Chen's intervention had not been merely protective but educational, teaching his daughter about the resources and responsibilities that came with military service. Their evening conversations now included discussions of leadership principles, strategic thinking, and the importance of using power responsibly rather than simply accumulating it for personal advantage. The documentation system that had protected Sarah became a teaching tool that Colonel Chen shared with other military families facing similar challenges. His comprehensive approach to gathering evidence, analyzing patterns, and engaging appropriate authorities provided a blueprint for parents who had previously felt powerless to protect their children from elite private school social dynamics. The quiet girl's ordeal had become a case study in military family resilience and institutional accountability. Mrs. Wellington's role as liaison for military families had evolved into something approaching a second career, as she discovered that her decades of experience with teenage behavior translated perfectly into advocacy for students whose backgrounds made them vulnerable to sophisticated forms of harassment. Her library had become an informal sanctuary for military dependents, a place where they could find both academic resources and emotional support from someone who understood their unique challenges. The three students who had once terrorized Sarah were completing their education through alternative arrangements that protected both them and their former classmates from further incidents. Bryce Kensington was finishing his senior year through online coursework supervised by private tutors, his college applications requiring explanations of disciplinary actions that made his family's legacy admission seem suddenly unreliable. Victoria Ashworth had transferred to a boarding school in Europe, where her family hoped that distance and time would allow her to develop the character that her privileged upbringing had failed to instill. Harrison, Colby's analytical mind was being redirected toward understanding the systems that had failed him rather than exploiting them for personal advantage. His mandatory counseling sessions focused on developing empathy and social responsibility, qualities that his family's wealth had inadvertently discouraged through its emphasis on strategic thinking and competitive advantage. The boy who had once designed campaigns to destroy his classmates was learning to use his intelligence for construction rather than destruction. The broader implications of Colonel Chen's intervention continued to ripple through elite educational institutions throughout the region. Private schools that had once operated according to unspoken hierarchies of family, wealth, and social connections were implementing new policies that emphasized character development and inclusive community building. The harassment of military dependents had become a liability that no institution could afford to ignore or minimize. Sarah's growing confidence manifested in her decision to try out for the debate team, an activity that had once seemed impossible. Given her need to avoid attention and potential conflict, her military background provided her with research skills and strategic thinking that made her a formidable competitor, while her experience with systematic harassment had given her insights into human psychology that enhanced her persuasive abilities. The winter formal that had once represented her exclusion from Westfield Academy's social hierarchy became an annual event that Sarah helped plan and organize, using her experience as a target of harassment to ensure that other vulnerable students felt welcome and protected. Her transformation from victim to advocate demonstrated the kind of leadership potential that military families often develop through their exposure to diverse communities and challenging circumstances. Colonel Chen's return from deployment marked the beginning of a new phase in their family's relationship with civilian institutions. His permanent assignment to the Pentagon Liaison Office meant that Sarah could finally experience the stability that had been missing from her military childhood, while his enhanced understanding of private school dynamics allowed him to support her continued education with appropriate levels of protection and advocacy. The legal settlements that concluded the harassment case provided resources for Sarah's college education while establishing precedents that would protect future military dependents from similar treatment. The three families who had attempted to use their wealth and influence to minimize consequences discovered that some forms of accountability could not be purchased or negotiated away through traditional channels. Sarah's junior year concluded with academic honors that reflected both her intellectual capabilities and her character development through adversity. Her essay for the National Merit Scholarship Competition focused on the vital importance of institutional accountability and the responsibility of privileged individuals to protect rather than exploit those who serve their country. The quiet girl, who had once tried to remain invisible, had found her voice and was using it to advocate for others who faced similar challenges. The transformation of Westfield Academy from an institution that protected predators to one that genuinely served all students represented a victory that extended far beyond one family struggle. Sarah Chen had learned that some battles required different kinds of courage than traditional military training emphasized, but she had also discovered that true strength came from understanding when to fight and when to summon reinforcements who possessed the authority to achieve lasting change. The lessons learned through months of harassment and ultimate triumph had prepared Sarah for leadership roles that would extend far beyond her high school experience. Her understanding of power dynamics, institutional accountability, and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals had been forged through personal experience rather than academic study, creating the kind of authentic leadership that military families often developed through their service to something greater than themselves. As Sarah prepared for her senior year and college applications. She carried with her the knowledge that true security came not from avoiding conflict, but from understanding the resources and principles that could transform individual struggle into systemic change. The quiet girl who had learned to make herself invisible had become a young woman who understood that some forms of visibility were necessary for protecting others who might face similar challenges in the future. 3 years later, Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the United States Military Academy at West Point, delivering the valedictorian address to her graduating class. The quiet girl who had once tried to disappear in Westfield Academy's hallways now commanded the attention of future military leaders with the same quiet authority her father had demonstrated in that parking lot years earlier. Leadership isn't about avoiding conflict, she told her classmates, her voice carrying across the parade ground with unmistakable conviction. It's about understanding when to fight, how to fight, and most importantly, what's worth fighting for. In the audience, Colonel Chen watched with the kind of pride that came from seeing his daughter transform personal adversity into purposeful service. Beside him sat Mrs. Wellington, now retired but still serving as an advocate for military families facing educational challenges. The documentation system they had pioneered had become standard protocol, protecting countless students from the kind of harassment Sarah had endured. Bryce Kensington watched the ceremony from his parents' living room, his own military service beginning next month as part of a court-mandated community service program. Victoria Ashworth had become an investigative journalist specializing in institutional accountability. Her family's media empire now focused on protecting rather than exploiting the vulnerable. Harrison Colby was completing his PhD in educational psychology, researching the dynamics that allowed harassment to flourish in elite institutions. The quiet girl who had learned to make herself invisible had become a beacon for others facing similar battles. Her story had taught an entire generation that true strength came not from inherited privilege but from understanding the resources and principles that could transform individual struggle into lasting change. If stories like Sarah's inspire you to think differently about courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they know. What's your take on how Sarah handled her situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful messages.